Imagine ruling the largest empire the world had ever seen. Your navy controls the oceans. Your currency finances global trade. Your flag flies across a quarter of the earth. From India to Africa to the Middle East to Hong Kong, the sun quite literally never sets on your empire. For more than a century, Britain had built a system of global dominance so vast that many believed it would last forever. But then something happened. Not a war, not a revolution, not a military defeat. Instead, over the course of a few quiet meetings between 1941 and 1947, a new power quietly forced Britain into a series of financial agreements that would dismantle the empire piece by piece. Agreements that looked harmless on paper: loans, trade deals, currency arrangements. But hidden inside them was a structural shift that would transfer the center of global power from London to Washington. And the most fascinating part of this story is that Britain itself helped sign those agreements. Which raises a deeper question. Was the collapse of the British Empire inevitable? Or was it quietly engineered through financial pressure by the rising superpower that replaced it? Because if you look closely at what happened between 1941 and 1947, you begin to see a pattern that has appeared again and again in global economic history. A pattern where declining empires don't fall through war alone, but through debt, currency leverage, and financial dependence. And if that pattern feels strangely familiar today, it's because some economists believe the same structural game is unfolding again in the modern world. To understand why this moment mattered so much, we need to step back for a second. Because for centuries before World War II, Britain had been the central hub of the global financial system. The British pound was the world's dominant currency. International trade was settled in London. The city of London functioned as the financial capital of the planet. If a country wanted loans, insurance, shipping finance, or investment capital, it went through British institutions. The British Empire wasn't just a military empire, it was a financial empire. And that system allowed Britain to punch far above its weight economically. But by the early 20th century, something had begun to change. Across the Atlantic, the United States was rising. Rapid industrialization had turned America into the world's manufacturing giant. By the 1920s, the U.S. economy was already larger than Britain's. But global financial power had not yet shifted. London still dominated international banking. Sterling was still the reserve currency. The British Empire still controlled global trade routes. In many ways, the world still ran through the institutions Britain had built. World War II would change that. Because wars don't just destroy cities and armies, they destroy financial systems. And by 1941, the British system was under immense strain. The empire that had financed global trade for generations was now borrowing money simply to survive, which meant something extraordinary was about to happen. For the first time in modern history, Britain would become financially dependent on another power. And that power was the United States. In March of 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt introduced a program that would change the trajectory of the war and the future of the British Empire. It was called the Lend-Lease Act. On the surface, the program sounded simple.
The United States would supply Britain with weapons, equipment, and supplies needed to continue fighting Nazi Germany. But the structure of the program was unusual. Rather than selling the equipment directly, America would technically lend it, or lease it, hence the name, Lend-Lease. Publicly, Roosevelt framed the program as an act of democratic solidarity, a way for America to support nations resisting fascism. And there was certainly truth to that. But privately, American policymakers understood that Lend-Lease also created a profound shift in the balance of power. Because every shipment of weapons, every delivery of supplies, every cargo ship full of equipment deepened Britain's financial dependence on the United States. And dependence in geopolitics is rarely temporary. Over time, it becomes structural. and structural dependence changes relationships between nations. What began as wartime assistance would soon evolve into something much larger, a financial transformation that would move the center of the global economic system away from London and toward Washington. But that transformation did not happen all at once. Instead, it unfolded through a series of negotiations, agreements, and financial arrangements between 1941 and 1947. Agreements that looked technical, even boring: currency rules, loan conditions, trade clauses. But taken together, they quietly dismantled the foundations of the British imperial system and replaced them with a new order centered around American financial power. The pivotal moment in that transition would arrive in 1944, in a quiet conference in a small town in New Hampshire, a conference that would design the financial architecture of the modern world, and more importantly, who would control it. In July of 1944, while World War II was still raging across Europe and the Pacific, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered in a quiet resort town in New Hampshire. The location was the Mount Washington Hotel. At first glance, the setting seemed almost peaceful: mountains, forests, fresh summer air. But inside the hotel, something far more consequential was taking place. This meeting would determine how the entire global financial system would work after the war ended, and more importantly, who would control it. The conference would later become known as the Bretton Woods Conference. On paper, the purpose of the meeting was straightforward. The world needed a new economic system to prevent the chaos that had followed World War I, the Great Depression, currency wars, trade protectionism. Those economic disasters had helped destabilize global politics and ultimately contributed to the rise of fascism. This time, the Allies wanted to build a financial structure that would stabilize the global economy. But behind the official purpose of the conference was another reality. By 1944, Britain and the United States were no longer equals in economic power. The war had drained Britain's treasury. Its overseas investments had been sold off. Its gold reserves had dwindled. Meanwhile, the United States had become the largest creditor nation on Earth. Nearly every major Allied country owed America money, which meant the country hosting the conference, the United States, arrived with enormous leverage. And leverage tends to shape negotiations. At the Bretton Woods Conference, two men represented the competing visions for the future global economy. On the British side was the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes understood something deeply troubling. Britain could no longer dominate the global financial system the way it had before the war. But he still hoped to design a structure that would protect countries from becoming trapped under the financial power of stronger nations. Keynes proposed the creation of a new global currency. He called it the Bancor. Instead of relying on any single country's money, international trade would be settled using this neutral currency, managed by an international institution. The idea was simple but powerful. If no single country controlled the world's reserve currency, then no single country could dominate the global financial system. But the American delegation had a very different idea. Leading the U.S. team was Harry Dexter White, a senior official at the U.S. Treasury. White's proposal was much simpler. Rather than creating a new global currency, the international financial system would be built around the U.S. dollar. Under this system, other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar would be backed by gold, and international trade would increasingly flow through American financial institutions. On the surface, the difference between these two plans might seem technical, but the implications were enormous. If Keynes' system had been adopted, global financial power would have been distributed across multiple nations. But if White's system prevailed, the United States would effectively become the center of the global monetary system. And given Britain's financial situation at the time, the outcome of the debate was almost inevitable. In the end, the American proposal largely won. The Bretton Woods agreements created two powerful new institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These organizations would provide financial stability, loans, and development funding for countries around the world. But the real structural change was the monetary system itself. Under the new arrangement, the U.S. dollar became the central reserve currency of the global economy. Countries held dollar reserves instead of gold. International trade increasingly moved through dollar-denominated transactions. This meant something subtle but extremely powerful. The global financial system was now anchored to the economy of a single country.
The United States. For Britain, this was a dramatic shift. For centuries, global finance had flowed through London. Now, the gravitational center of the world economy was moving across the Atlantic, toward Washington and New York. But even more important than Bretton Woods was what happened after the war ended. Because once the fighting stopped, Britain's financial crisis became impossible to ignore. By 1945, Britain had technically won the war, but economically, the victory came at an enormous cost. The country was exhausted, its infrastructure was damaged, its industries needed rebuilding, and perhaps most importantly, it was deeply in debt. During the war, Britain had relied heavily on American supplies through the Lend-Lease Act. But when the war ended in 1945, the United States made a surprising decision. It abruptly ended the Lend-Lease program, almost overnight. This created a financial emergency for Britain. Without continued American support, the British government faced a massive shortage of dollars needed to purchase food, raw materials, and industrial equipment. The empire that had once financed global trade now struggled to pay for basic imports. So Britain had no choice. It needed a loan. And that loan would come from the United States. In 1946, the British government negotiated a massive financial agreement with Washington. This became known as the Anglo-American Loan Agreement. The loan amounted to $3.75 billion, an enormous sum at the time. But the money came with conditions that would reshape the structure of the British Empire itself. Because one of the key requirements was that Britain dismantle many of its imperial trade preferences. For decades, the British Empire had operated under a system where colonies traded primarily with Britain. These preferential trade networks had been one of the economic foundations of imperial power. Now, under pressure from the United States, Britain was being asked to open those markets to global competition. In other words, to dismantle the economic architecture that had sustained the empire. And once that process began, the political structure of the empire soon followed. Within just a few years, India gained independence. Large parts of Africa moved towards self-rule. Colonial influence weakened across Asia and the Middle East. The empire that had once controlled a quarter of the world's land and population began to unravel with astonishing speed. But this raises an even more interesting question. Did the United States intentionally design this system to replace Britain as the world's dominant power? Or was the collapse of the British Empire simply an unintended consequence of wartime economics? To answer that question, we need to look at what happened in the decades that followed. Because the system created in the 1940s didn't just shape the post-war world, it defined the entire global economy for the next half-century. And the ripple effects of that system can still be felt today. By the end of World War II, Britain stood among the victors. The Axis powers had been defeated, Europe was being rebuilt, and on paper, the British Empire still existed. It still controlled territories across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Millions of people still lived under British rule. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. Britain had won the war militarily, yet economically it had emerged weaker than ever before. The war had drained the country's wealth. Industrial production needed rebuilding. Infrastructure had suffered years of bombardment, And most importantly, the financial system that once sustained the empire had been transformed. The new global order created at Bretton Woods had placed the U.S. dollar at the center of international trade. For the first time in modern history, Britain no longer controlled the dominant global currency. That role now belonged to the United States. And currency dominance matters far more than most people realize. Because when your currency becomes the world's reserve currency, other countries need to hold it. They use it for trade, they borrow in it, they store their national reserves in it, which means the country issuing that currency gains extraordinary economic influence. By the late 1940s, that influence belonged to the United States.
Under the Bretton Woods system, currencies around the world were tied to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself was tied to gold. Specifically, 1 ounce of gold was fixed at $35. This arrangement created a new kind of monetary hierarchy. Countries could exchange their dollars for gold through the U.S. Treasury, but international trade increasingly flowed through American financial institutions. The dollar became the lubricant of global commerce, and as more countries accumulated dollar reserves, the influence of the United States expanded. Meanwhile, Britain faced the opposite problem. Its currency, the pound sterling, had once been the backbone of global finance, but now it struggled to maintain its position. In fact, Britain soon faced a serious currency crisis because one of the conditions of the Anglo-American Loan Agreement required Britain to make the pound freely convertible into dollars. This meant foreign investors and governments could exchange pounds for dollars at will. At first, this seemed like a reasonable step toward restoring global trade, but the consequences were immediate and severe. In 1947, as soon as convertibility began, massive amounts of capital flowed out of Britain. Foreign holders of pounds rushed to convert them into dollars. Britain's dollar reserves evaporated almost overnight. Within weeks, the government was forced to suspend convertibility again. The financial strain was enormous, and it became increasingly clear that Britain no longer sustained the economic structure of a global empire. Empires depend on more than military power. They depend on economic systems, trade networks, financial institutions, currency influence. Once those systems begin to weaken, the political structure of the empire often follows. And that is exactly what happened in the late 1940s. One of the first and most significant changes occurred in 1947. That year, Britain granted independence to India. India had long been considered the crown jewel of the empire. Its population was vast, its resources were immense, and its strategic importance was enormous. Yet maintaining control had become increasingly expensive and politically unstable. After years of nationalist pressure led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, Britain made the decision to withdraw. The creation of India and Pakistan marked a turning point. It signaled that the era of European colonial empires was beginning to end. Over the next 2 decades, independence movements spread rapidly across the empire, across Africa, across the Middle East, across Asia. Countries that had once been governed from London gradually gained sovereignty. And while each independence movement had its own local causes, the broader pattern was clear. Britain no longer possessed the financial strength required to maintain imperial control. The economic center of gravity had shifted from London to Washington. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting, because while the British Empire was fading, another form of global influence was rising. The United States did not build a traditional colonial empire. It did not govern vast territories directly in the same way Britain once had. Instead, it constructed something different, a network of alliances, financial institutions, military bases, and economic relationships. Through organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the United States helped shape economic policy across large parts of the world. Through institutions like NATO, it built security alliances that extended its geopolitical influence.
And through the dominance of the U.S. dollar, it anchored global trade to the American financial system. This was not an empire in the traditional sense, but it was a system of global influence that placed the United States at the center of the international order, a kind of financial and geopolitical architecture that would define the second half of the 20th century. But history rarely stands still, because every global system eventually faces challenges, and over time, new powers emerge, new economic centers rise, new geopolitical strategies take shape, which brings us to a fascinating question. Could the same structural pattern that once shifted power from Britain to the United States be beginning to appear again today? Because if you examine the modern global economy closely, you start to see signs of another potential transition, a shift that some analysts believe could reshape the world order once again. And the clues to that shift are appearing in places many people would not expect. From currency markets, to global trade routes, to the strategic ambitions of rising powers. The story that began with the quiet financial agreements of the 1940s may not be finished after all. In fact, it may only be entering its next chapter. By the early 1950s, the transformation of global power was complete.
The British Empire had not disappeared overnight. Its flag still flew across many territories, its diplomatic influence remained significant, and London continued to be one of the world's great financial centers. But the foundation that had once sustained the empire for centuries had shifted. For generations, global trade had revolved around the British pound. Nations held their reserves in sterling. Shipping, insurance, and banking flowed through British institutions. London had been the financial heart of the international system. Now that role had moved elsewhere. Increasingly, international trade was conducted in U.S. dollars. Central banks around the world began accumulating dollar reserves. Governments borrowed from institutions influenced heavily by Washington, and major financial decisions were now shaped by policies set in the United States. What had once been a British-centered global order was now an American-centered one. And unlike the traditional empires that came before it, this new structure did not rely primarily on colonial control. It relied on something far more subtle: financial architecture, institutions, currency dominance, trade networks, military alliances. Instead of ruling colonies directly, the United States built a system where much of the global economy functioned through structures it helped design after World War II. Through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, financial stability programs and development loans often flowed through frameworks shaped by American economic thinking. Through security alliances such as NATO, the United States anchored its geopolitical influence across large parts of the world. And through the global role of the U.S. dollar, trade, commodities, and finance became deeply tied to the American financial system. Oil transactions, international loans, global reserves, and cross-border trade increasingly relied on dollars. This meant something extremely powerful. Countries around the world needed dollars to participate fully in global markets, which gave the United States extraordinary influence over international finance. It could borrow at lower costs, it could run larger deficits, and its financial institutions became central hubs of the global economy. For decades, this system worked remarkably well. The post-war period saw massive economic growth. International trade expanded rapidly. Europe and Japan rebuilt their economies. Global poverty fell in many regions. The American-led financial order provided stability that the world had lacked during the chaotic years between the two world wars. But history has a pattern. No global economic system remains unchallenged forever. And over the past few decades, new dynamics have begun to emerge. New economic powers have risen. New trade networks have developed. New financial strategies are quietly taking shape.
One of the most significant of these shifts has been the rapid rise of China. Over the past 40 years, China has transformed itself from a largely agricultural economy into the world's largest manufacturing powerhouse. Its factories produce everything from electronics to industrial machinery. Its trade networks span continents. Its infrastructure investments stretch across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. And increasingly, China has begun experimenting with ways to reduce its reliance on the dollar-based financial system. Trade agreements conducted in local currencies, alternative payment systems, regional development banks, new financial partnerships with emerging economies. None of these developments alone overturn the existing system, but together they suggest something interesting. The global financial architecture that emerged after the Bretton Woods conference may be slowly evolving, not collapsing overnight, but gradually adapting as new economic centers gain influence. Some analysts see parallels between this moment and earlier transitions in world history. When Spain's imperial power faded in the 17th century, financial leadership shifted toward the Dutch Republic. When Dutch dominance waned, Britain emerged as the central financial hub of the 19th century. And after the immense costs of two world wars weakened Britain, the United States rose to shape the global economic order that defined the modern era. Each transition unfolded differently. Each was shaped by wars, economic crises, and political decisions. But they all shared a similar underlying pattern. Rising economic power eventually reshapes financial systems, and financial systems ultimately shape geopolitical power. The quiet agreements between 1941 and 1947 did not immediately destroy the British Empire, but they altered the foundations of the global system in ways that made Britain's imperial structure increasingly unsustainable. The world that emerged after World War II was no longer organized around London. It was organized around Washington. And understanding how that transformation happened helps explain something important about global history. Great powers rarely lose influence suddenly. More often, the shift begins quietly, through economic pressure, through debt, through currency dominance, through institutions that gradually redefine the rules of global trade. The moment when the balance finally becomes visible often arrives long after the underlying system has already changed. Which raises an intriguing question for the present. If the global order can shift once, it can shift again. And if the mechanisms that reshaped the world in the 1940s still exist today, then the next transformation may already be quietly unfolding. Not through dramatic battles or sudden collapses, but through the same subtle forces that have shaped the rise and fall of great powers throughout history. Financial leverage, currency influence, and the quiet negotiations that determine how the world's economic system is organized. Because sometimes the most important turning points in history are not the ones fought on battlefields. They are the ones signed in conference rooms. And by the time the world realizes what has changed, the new order is already in place.